So let's start with a brief history of advertising. We're going to go decade by decade. So from the 1940s to 2010 and beyond. So we're going to call these decades Patriotic Consumerism, Creative Revolution, an era of positioning, visual literacy, the dot-com dot-bomb, the digital decade, and age of disruption. Let's start with the late 40s and 50s, which has been called the Patriotic Consumerism decade. So at this time, advertisers weren't just selling products, they were selling the idea of consumption as a patriotic act after World War II. It was really defining the very essence of American culture. Television was a new medium, and at first, companies like Colgate and Westinghouse sponsored the entire program lineup. And they used the stars of the programs, like Lucy and Ricky, to use a hard sell approach to pitch their products. Then ad agencies realized that you could sell sponsorship to multiple companies, and that is when advertising became a space race. So once they realized this, advertisers, that you could offer sponsorships to multiple sponsors for multiple products, that you could actually sell the space, the commercial time slots, it changed everything. And at that time, believe it or not, a puppet character called Howdy Doody that was popular in a kids show sold everything from Twinkies to record players to toys to toothpaste. As I said, advertising not only helped the economy, it helped to shape our culture and our consciousness. It created a love affair with cars and with our need to keep up with the Joneses by buying the newest model of whatever. You might also be interested to know that the idea that you needed a diamond ring to ask someone to marry you, that was created by advertising, by a copywriter named Francis Garrity, who came up with the idea for De Beers. This line that you've heard now for a long time, a diamond is forever, that was a brainchild of advertising. So what happened was in the late 40s into the 50s, advertising wasn't just selling products, it was actually selling dreams. Now, in the 60s, this was the era of what we called the Creative Revolution. So this was sparked by a Think Small ad for Volkswagen from a very famous advertising agency called Doyle Dane Bernbach. And it inspired advertisers to drop the hard sell approach of the 1950s for a smarter, self-deprecating tone. It's interesting to note that up until this point, advertising was all about the writing. Copywriters ruled. In the 60s, art directors and copywriters partnered to come up with ideas, and the art directors illustrated the ads and really defined their visual style. Here are a few ads that were popular then. So at that point, wit and humor were really ruling the day. Ads for Levy's rye bread, which said you don't have to be Jewish to love Levy's, the VW Think Small ad, and if you click on this link, you can actually watch this cigarette ad for Benson's and Hedges. These were really using humor, just as a very long-standing campaign in the 60s for Charmin featuring a little creepy grocer named Mr. Whipple. So this character, his duty, he felt in the commercials, was to keep customers from squeezing the Charmin. And in fact, what happened was we would always catch Mr. Whipple finding the Charmin irresistible himself. Believe it or not, this might seem pretty silly then, but there was a huge fan base for these commercials. In fact, there were over 500 of them made. And even though people might have really hated Mr. Whipple, he made them remember the toilet paper brand, and they bought it. So Whipple got attention, but at what cost? this was something that creatives thought about. So, for instance, if someone spits on a table in front of you, you might remember it, but why? For a good reason? Maybe not. At any rate, the creative revolution allowed us to try out new things to get attention. Let's move on to the 1970s. So, while Whipple got the attention of the bean counters, um, actually, they ended up wresting control from the creatives in the 70s. And I say Whipple got the attention of the bean counters because Whipple actually rang up sales and all of the money people liked it. However, in the 70s, there was a minor recession and gas rationing. The culture of advertising changed to become more media oriented. There was a marked shift to a preference for discipline and measurability. So, marketers in the 70s were looking for accountability and efficiency in their ad agencies and campaigns, and they used something called positioning as a more scientific technique for placing ads in the minds of consumers. If you click on this link, it'll take you to this commercial, which is one of the first ones for 7 Up. And it was positioning 7 Up as the un-cola. So it positioned itself against Coca-Cola. So I invite you to look at that. Now, there were other ads that really were all about positioning a product for a certain kind of person. So as you can see in these ads, these vans were positioning themselves for a certain kind of man, right, who would consider a car an adult toy. In the ad for Canadian Club, it was positioning itself for a certain kind of super macho man who was a player and attracted the ladies. Now, in the 1980s, affluence, improved transportation, changes in mass communication influenced the development of extremely large ad agencies with branches throughout the world. Um, and there was a lot of acquisitions. Let's look at the 80s and see what kind of advertising we saw at that time. So, the 1980s were called the decade of the deal and of visual literacy. So I already talked about the fact that these ad agencies were buying each other. Also remember that cable TV was starting to emerge, and it had a profound impact in reshaping the TV industry during this decade. And as these cable channels prospered, they really undermined the influence of traditional broadcast networks. So the once dominant networks saw their portion of evening news audience slip. And in addition to cable TV, this was when the first VCRs allowed viewers to manage, organize, and control the programs available to them. So you saw a lot of ads at this time that were for these expensive jeans, right? You also saw ads that were a little bit different. You saw ads like this very famous Apple ad, which was the 1984 ad. And the idea was here that while information and positioning seemed to be working really well, as you saw in the ad featuring Brooke Shields, the thinking was that information without emotion was not retained. So in this ad, which you've probably seen, that was advertising the very first Apple computer during the Super Bowl, it was really an ad that was railing against Microsoft, and it has a very futuristic and Big Brother feeling to it. So I'd invite you to have a look at this ad. So now let's talk about the 20s, and the 20s, the 90s. And we've already talked about the 90s when we talked about the internet, right? And that it was the rise of the dot-com, and of course also had the dot bomb at the end of the decade. So as we talked about, with the birth of internet advertising in 1994, 95, the number of websites that were in existence grew exponentially. And I told you a story about this company called pets.com, which was really a precursor of companies like Chewy that didn't end up succeeding because the dot-com bubble burst. I showed you what websites looked like, right? And obviously, Google looked very different, as did Apple. And what happened was during the dot bomb, as we discussed, hundreds of e commerce and media sites were shuttered when they were the victims of the downturn in dot com values on Wall Street. And this is, known as the dot bomb. So let's talk about the digital decade from 2001 to 2010. So, believe it or not, in 2000, most people still hadn't heard of Google. They were still watching a lot of their content on TV, in newspapers, and radio. So, the majority of ad money and effort was still spent on those media. The online ad spend began to increase as consumers spent more time online. So, for comparison, in 2000, 1 out of every 40 homes had a broadband network. So, that was about 2.6 million people. By 2009, there were 80 million, or 67% of the US population, that had broadband. In fact, broadband went from being practically unknown to a common household term. But again, that was the end of this decade. From 2000 to like 2006, 2007, a lot of people were still watching TV. So they were watching Super Bowl spots like this one, which is very famous, and you can watch it if you want. I embedded the link here. It's pretty funny. So I put these statistics here. I thought you might be interested to know what Bill Gates' predictions were at the beginning of the decade versus what actually happened. So, as you can see, he predicted maybe 2.7 million people on broadband. In 2001, he said that's how many would be online in 2010. And you can see that, in fact, by 2010, there were 80 million people on broadband. He did not predict DVRs. By 2010, there were 51 million of them. He thought maybe 51 million people would be using them in 2010. There were 270 million. There were no music players in 2001. By 2010, 76% of households were using digital music players. So let's move forward. We're going pretty quick because there's a lot of ground to cover in this lecture. Let's move forward to the present. So I call from 2011 to the present the age of disruption, because we have companies like Amazon that have completely disrupted shopping by making it all online, free delivery, gets to you quick. Airbnb did the same thing, disrupting the whole hotel industry. Uber did the same for the cab industry, and certainly Netflix for TV, right? It's the most well-known of the online streaming companies. So, an age of disruption. So, given that ad agencies no longer just make advertising to be placed as paid, earned, and owned media, but they actually partner with their advertisers, right, their clients, to figure out how to disrupt how business is done in their corner of the market. Who do you think are the top 10 advertisers in the US right now? Do you think that that's made a lot of difference in terms of the types of advertisers? Let's have a look. You'll see, in fact, that these are the 10 top advertisers in the US. Now, of course, we all recognize that auto manufacturers always spend a lot of money advertising their products. Telecommunications companies, though, spend nearly as much as or more than General Motors on US advertising. That might be surprising to you. And only 3 of the top 10 US advertisers are companies based outside of the US. So now, what does it cost to advertise? Here's some prices for you. And you can see that it's, the prices range from $20 for 1,000 impressions, that means views, for a sponsored photo on Instagram, all the way up to $2.5 million for the cost of 4 weeks on the biggest billboard in Times Square. You can also see what it costs for airtime during a prime NFL Sunday afternoon game. So this just gives you an idea of what the costs are. It's not cheap. So let's talk about the media, the specific advertising media that were used then and now. So in previous decades, traditional advertising media is TV commercials, print ads, radio, right? And we're all used to the intrusive, sort of interruptive type of blinking banners and spokespeople dancing around talking about products that you absolutely must buy now, unfortunately. But advertising is more than that. Advertising has evolved from shouting at customers to connecting with them. Advertising now is everything that a brand does or says, from commercials to video, websites, blogs, data, endorsements, product development, hashtagging, packaging, to politics. And here's a few examples. So, advertising is obviously print and digital ads, like this one that we all know pretty well from Nike. It's digital ads like these that are pretty clever, right? This ad for McDonald's is an ad that's called Y-Fries, and it's trying to tell people that you don't have to work in a coffee shop. Remember those days when you could do that? You can also actually come and hang out at McDonald's because we've got good Wi-Fi. There's other kinds of print advertising that are posters in 2D that you'll see in the MTA and you'll see in lots of different places, right? In billboards. There's public service announcements. This is one for Greenpeace in Canada, and this was all part of the fairly recent push to try to get people to stop using plastic straws because it's really eroding, it's really causing a lot of havoc in our oceans, right? Thus the tagline, "Don't suck the life from our oceans." We all know there's lots of TV commercials, right? And I have a few examples here that I invite you to actually watch. The Apple one was introducing Face ID, and it shows a boomer who's basically laying on a lawn chair, and his phone rings, and it's motorized, and so he motors himself up, and the phone recognizes his face, unlocks, and he sees who it is, and he doesn't answer. But this other ad, I really encourage you to watch because this is an ad that you would not expect from Procter and Gamble, and it's all about the idea of what does it mean to be black in America. And it's called The Talk, and it's actually it's not called The Talk. That was the previous ad that was similar to this one. This one is called The Look, and I'd encourage you to watch this because you'd be surprised that this is actually a piece of advertising. Advertising is also pop-ups. So this is a cafe that was created by a company called Pantone, which basically is the very definition of colors. And so they created a Pantone pop-up where everything was rated and described and labeled according to colors. Chatbots. If you've ever used a chatbot, believe it or not, that's also advertising. Someone wrote that, someone figured out what the conversations would be. Advertising is also campaigns that happen in places like the MTA. So this was a takeover of a train station to help promote the Bowie Is exhibit at the Brooklyn Museum, and it actually integrated the idea of what was Bowie's New York using all of the different media that we're used to seeing in the MTA. For instance, having maps of where Bowie would go in the museum, having special MTA tickets, actually putting his face on the stairs. So this is also, so this is called out of home. It's also advertising. Memes are also advertising. You might have seen some of these. And you might have seen some of these. And you might have seen some of these. So believe it or not, advertising agencies actually employ people to try to come up with and to jump on memes. Now, this is another piece of advertising I invite you to watch. This is an amazing project where school kids were told they were going on a field trip, and what happened was the inside of the bus itself was turned into a collective VR experience. And as it moved, if you click on this link to watch the video, the kids actually saw in the windows of the bus Mars, what it would look like if they were traveling. It's an astonishing piece of advertising. There's also advertising that's for, social causes. So if you watch this video, you'll see that this was created by a pet food company to show a little girl who, instead of a birthday party, actually wanted to donate to a shelter. You might have seen this video of a watermelon explosion. It's pretty funny. I put the link here if you want to watch it. I'm sure you saw Chewbacca Mom, and I know you know about Pokemon Go. All of these things, believe it or not, are also forms of advertising, just as are quizzes, right? All those quizzes that you see, these are forms of advertising. They're often sponsored by advertisers. Of course, blogs are also advertising, right? The blog posts themselves are written a lot of times for certain advertisers or nonprofits. Believe it or not, even email is advertising. I'm sure you get a ton of them. And in fact, here are some email subject lines that I wish were actually written, because I would be inclined to open a subject line that said, "Where to drink beer right now." This is another example of advertising that you can click on. So ads aren't just something that is asking you for your money and is very hard sell. So Duracell, the battery company, actually realized that during the holidays, Christmas and Hanukkah and so on, that very often families get gifts for their kids that need batteries, and they don't realize they need the batteries until the last minute. So Duracell actually created a program that delivered batteries to panicked parents on Christmas Eve, during Hanukkah, and so on, that parents could call a hotline and the batteries were actually delivered to them. So Duracell actually was able to, in some sense, save Christmas. Again, this is advertising. Advertising is also activism. Advertising is, you saw during Obama's campaigns, he was the one who, his campaign managers were the first ones to really use social media to ignite activism. Certainly during the Women's March, these were posters that were created by a nonprofit called Amplify. Um, Advertising and social media are really very powerful tools to ignite activism and to help people connect. So we're around halfway through this lecture. So if you wanted to take a break before we keep going, now would be a good time to do so. Next, though, we're going to talk about, so I just showed you a lot of examples of advertising, but let's pull back and talk about what's the purpose of advertising. What do you think? Is it A? Is it B? Is it C or D? Actually, it's all of the above. Advertising's purpose is to help. So, of course, there have always been and always will be some objections to advertising, right? Because advertising feeds consumerism. And, you can go too far. So, there's three main arguments that critics make about advertising. That advertising, because it costs money, it adds to the cost of products, right? And the industry would counter that by saying that advertising helps to make more goods and services available and creates competition, which keeps prices lower. Critics also say that advertising maybe causes people to buy products they don't need. This is absolutely true. But the usefulness, the function of advertising is it might help consumers understand better what product they're buying or encourage them not to continue to buy a product that's not working for them, to instead consider an alternative. So, of course, there's always a concern that advertising actually reduces competition and fosters monopolies, right? So, if you look at the rising cost of advertising, especially on TV, it limits what companies can afford to launch a new product or campaign through TV. But when you consider all of the costs of running a business, advertising is still an inexpensive way to let people know about new products and services. So, at its best, I like to say, right? We just talked about this. And the question is, how do we connect? Let's talk about that a little bit better. How do we connect in a way that adds value? So, this is Cicero. He was a Roman politician. He lived in from 43 to 63 BC, a smart man. And he knew that if you want to connect with people, you have to be empathetic so that you can experience things through their eyes, which is why he said, if you wish to persuade me, you must think my thoughts, feel my feelings, and speak my words. So the best advertising really gets people involved. That's how you add value. Because if you tell me something, I'll forget. If you show me something, I may remember. If you involve me, I will learn. And this is why more and more today, brands are asking you to collaborate. What do you think of this? Do you like that? Would you like to be part of this experience? Give us feedback. This is what brands understand is meant by adding value. So, for anyone who's interested in advertising and who might think, it might be a career for me, I want to tell you what I like about it and what you might like about it. So, I really like solving business problems with ideas. That's my job as a writer and creative director. And I've solved a lot of business problems for a lot of different brands, a lot of advertisers, from Tide to Bud Light to Peet's Coffee and Tea to GMC, Princess Cruises, you name it, right? But there's other kinds of brands that are not just strictly selling you products or services, right? I also like solving higher ed business problems. That's what I do as a professor at City College, right? And I've worked specifically on some problems for educational brands as a copywriter in addition to being a professor. So lynda.com, for instance. I also like solving professional business problems. So thinking about, how do I help creative directors be better creative directors? How can I create curriculum for them? I like solving business problems of, how do you get young people to want to sign up for health care when they think that they don't need health care because they're young and strong? This was a brand problem that I solved by saying, well, let's get young people to speak to young people because they're not going to listen to anyone else. Now, you can see a lot more of my work at Vimeo. If you click here, you'll see a lot of videos and TV I've done, and you can see a lot more beyond that on my website, RebeccaRivera.com. if you're curious. Now, the good news is you don't have to be a creative to solve problems in creative ways, right? Like I did when I created a company called Speed Mentoring. In fact, really, what you need the most is a curious mind and a desire to be paid to solve problems in creative ways, even if you're not creative. So I think it's really interesting that this is something Albert Einstein, a scientist, said. He said, "I have no special talents. I am only passionately curious." So if you're a curious person, I would say advertising might be a good career choice for you. Now, something else to know about advertising is it moves really, really fast at light speed. You have to figure out who your client and customers are and put together a solution for them in record time. And in fact, this is a post by a creative director who talked about putting together a pitch and winning it and getting the advertising out in record time. This is not unusual. So it's very fast-paced industry. So I said it's not about being the most creative person. It's also not about being the smartest person. It's about having IQ, right? Certain amount of intelligence, EQ, which is emotional intelligence, and CQ, which is curiosity and cultural intelligence. So I say that your liberal arts education is really great preparation for a career in advertising. So if you want to look at it a little more deeply, here's how I would break the qualities down of someone who does well in advertising, someone who's curious, adaptable, who's a problem solver, and collaborative. Someone who has a certain kind of mindset, a growth mindset. So I'd invite you to look at this comparison between growth mindset and fixed mindset, because this is actually something that whether you're a person who's interested in advertising or not, when you're getting an education, having a growth mindset will actually benefit you more than having a fixed mindset. So for instance, someone who has a fixed mindset will say, "This is too hard." Someone who has a growth mindset will say, "Well, it is hard. It might take some time and effort," but they don't give up. A fixed mindset might say, "I just can't do math." And a growth mindset would say, "I'm going to try to train my brain in math." Fixed mindset will say, "Oh, I made a mistake." And a growth mindset will say, "Mistakes help me learn better." So think about, are you a fixed mindset person or growth mindset person? Because whether you're interested in advertising or not, I guarantee you if you can try to evolve your mindset more toward the growth mindset, you're going to do better in school and it's going to be less stressful. So there are lots of advertising roles. And, I didn't go into this kind of depth with the other industries, frankly, because I don't work in those industries and I work in advertising, so I find it a little bit more fascinating. So there's a lot of different roles that you can see here, from a writer to a strategist to a data scientist to media connector to producer to diversity officer. So we've all seen this image of Mad Men, right? So these were people who were fulfilling these roles. And the show gave the impression that the industry really hasn't changed. So it's a good question to ask, how much has it changed in terms of the way an agency is organized, what the roles are, who runs things, and so on. So I would say this more reflects an agency today. So things have changed a lot, but not enough yet. I have to be honest, in advertising, there's still not enough women at the highest levels. You still go to award shows and you see this, a lot of guys and one girl. You still go to an award show and see this, a lot of white guys, not very many people of color. But it is changing, thankfully. And there are agencies that I know of that are making a difference, like this agency in Texas called Sanders Wingo that my friend Scott works at, or this agency here in New York called Wolf and Wilhelmine. So advertising is changing. If you were interested in a career in advertising, what I would say to you in general is if you want to succeed, you want to be this guy who's like really amped, who is excited about what he does, who is gung ho, who's up for anything, and who's really just always ready to rock and roll. You want to be this guy, not this guy. Okay? Now, I want to talk to you real briefly, give you a quick overview of the bloodline, if you will, of the ad agency industry to give you an idea of how big it is. So in the US, there's around 200,000 people who are employed by the largest ad agencies, as you can see by this graphic. And there are 10 global ad agencies. And these large ad agencies and more are owned by these groups. So here you see like Interpublic Group, Publicis Group, Omnicom Group, WPP. So these are parent companies. And you can see how much money these ad agencies make. It's a lot. Now, these large ad agencies on the left are owned by the massive parent companies. So let's look at one of these really large ad agencies called Ogilvy. You might have heard of Ogilvy. It has 450 offices in 120 countries, and it has a lot of specialty units like these ones. And these specialty units, they specialize in social. They might specialize in, I don't know, in VR, in AI, in data science, in public relations, in healthcare, and so on. Now, I worked in a lot of agencies on the West and East Coast. I was on staff at the ones you see on the left, and some of the titles that I held were these titles. Now, I also was freelance and worked for a lot of companies directly, and these were some of my titles. And you can see some of the titles are kind of funky. Now, let's continue to talk about Ogilvy and what made that agency so memorable and why a lot of us have heard of it. And it was because it was created by a man named David Ogilvy. And it became one of the largest marketing communications companies in the world. And Ogilvy is he was one of the most quotable ad men who ever lived. And he said things like this: any damn fool can put on a deal, but it takes a genius, faith, and perseverance to create a brand. In other words, anyone can have a 99-cent item, but to create a brand that people remember and that they will choose, even if their price is a little more, that is genius. He also talked about the fact that consumers should never be underestimated. And the way that he did that was he said things like, the consumer isn't a moron, she's your wife. So big ad agencies are not the only players anymore. There are lots of consultancies. And there was this myth of the 3-martini lunch, so I use it here as a metaphor. And these smaller consultancies are having a real impact by focusing on very specific specialties. And they're doing things in a very different sort of way. So they're actually working with their clients to disrupt their business from the inside. They're really focusing on collaboration. They're really maybe focusing specifically on creativity and so on. These companies are really doing things differently. So how can you tell that things really are different? Well, these were the ad agency roles then, right? And these are ad agency titles now. right? Operations producer, free range strategist. I actually pulled these titles from LinkedIn and from some current ads, and you can see they're very different, right? Chief of culture, multicultural marketer, mobile specialist, youth marketer, digital native, so talent specialists. So they're very different. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the ad agency departments. For students who are really interested, maybe ad PR students, I'd encourage you to look at these different ad departments so that you can understand. There's 4 basic departments: account management, creative, media, and production. And I'm not going to go through those specifically now. Again, if you're an ad PR major, I encourage you to look at these more closely. But I will just tell you roughly what these departments do. So the account team's supposed to be focusing on developing strategies to help the brand solve business problems. They're more about the business, right? And then you also have strategists who study the motivations and consumer behavior. So you can look at this again more closely. So media strategy and buying really is they have to understand every form of media, and they have to figure out where's the best place to put the message, and they have to actually buy it. The production department are the people who actually make stuff happen, from creating TV commercials to websites to mobile, you name it. And then, of course, there's a creative department. These are the people who actually come up with the ideas. Now, beyond that, there's new emerging disciplines like experience design, right? And there's lots of different flavors of this. And it's a really interesting area to be involved in advertising right now. So you can look at those a little more closely if you want to. There's also brand strategy, and you can see in these next couple of slides that companies are organizing themselves completely different. So at any rate, I'm not going to go into detail on that. I encourage you, again, if you're an ad PR student, look at those things more closely. So this information that was in this lecture, you might have noticed, is not what was in the chapter if you've read it. This is much more contemporary information about the industry. So I'd encourage you to make sure you read the chapter in addition to this information. So what's going to happen next